Okay, I'm going to just give myself a bit of a break here and ask, has anybody been to Antarctica? Two of you, okay. So for the rest of you at least, it's still terra incognita. That's what the talk is about today, or this afternoon. There's quite a lot of slides to go through, so I'm going to have to run this rather quickly. Really in about half an hour, so that hopefully we can leave time for questions. And I'm not quite sure how well the TV is going to show the slides either. But we'll see how it goes. And I'm lucky enough to have been to the frozen south on 3 separate occasions. That does not make me an expert on Antarctica by any means, but it does make me passionate about the place. And just to introduce the place briefly for those of you who perhaps don't really know what Antarctica is, here's a few facts and figures. It's over 5 million square miles. This is not some insignificant island. You know, it's a continent, the 5th largest continent on the planet, and it occupies a space, as you're going to see shortly, right over the South Pole. And it's so otherworldly, that it wasn't known about until 1820. And even after the first sighting, there was still not much wide kind of extrapolation of that knowledge into the sort of wider civilized world until the late 19th century. So it really is only been known about by humans for a very short period of time. It was speculated about for a long time. As you can see, very small numbers of people are there at any one time. At least 1,000 square miles for every single human being there. And the really incredible thing about it is that there is no real government in Antarctica. It is controlled or conducted, if you will. Human activity there is conducted through the Antarctic Treaty, which is one of the most effective collaborative endeavors ever made by humankind. It protects the environment from all mineral exploitation, and the only activity that can be carried on there is scientific research. The standard of environmental protection is the highest on Earth, and even so, there are still issues. So just to give you an idea of Antarctica from a map point of view, I don't know if this doesn't work on this, does it? Does it? No, it doesn't. Okay. Hopefully you can see that. The South Pole is right in the middle, and an awful lot of Antarctica is the East Antarctic ice sheet here. It is the highest continent overall on Earth, and most of it is covered with ice that is over 2 miles thick. So that's an astonishing amount of water. Over 70% of all of the Earth's fresh water is locked up here. And that makes it a very significant place. If that were all to disappear, sea levels would rise by something in the order of 70 meters. So obviously we don't want that to happen, since 40% of the Earth's population lives within 10 meters of sea level. An interesting thing to contemplate. Anyway, so for visitors, you can approach it from Australia or New Zealand. It's a 5-day journey across the Southern Ocean here. Or you can approach it from South America, which is how the vast majority of people go there. And as you can see, it's a much narrower gap between the Tierra del Fuego, the bottom of South America, and the Antarctic Peninsula. But it's still over 2 days of sailing on the Southern Ocean. So this is a really, really significant bit of water. And one of the interesting things about it, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, is that when you're a visitor to Antarctica, the vast majority of people who go there, that's a few thousand people each year who visit by ship, never get south of the Antarctic Circle. Most of them remain here on a peninsula, which is north of the Antarctic Circle. You feel like you're in Antarctica, all right, but you're still not within the Antarctic Circle. So the vast majority of it really, really remains very remote, virtually never visited. It's an incredible place, a really otherworldly place. This gives an idea of the relationship between the peninsula and what most visitors will experience. So you can see the crossing of the Drake Passage, the most notorious bit of seawater on planet Earth. And anyone who's ever been there, it doesn't really matter. You can go there and it's dead flat calm, but generally it's pretty breezy. The reason that it is so notorious is that the Southern Ocean circulates continuously on the Coriolis effect winds. So there's a more or less constant westerly blowing, and it narrows between the peninsula and South America, and so that's where the energy intensifies. And there's as a result of that, both at force 11, 12, and higher wind speeds. Well, there's no both at force higher than force 12, but it feels like it sometimes. It's not great if you suffer from motion sickness, let's put it that way. So what's there? Well, even if you only go to the peninsula, it's a remarkable experience of mountains and coast. And as you can see, there is some exposed rock in parts. Even the peninsula, which juts out into the Southern Ocean, so it does experience prevailing winds with precipitation. There's not a vast amount of snow, typically maybe 30 to 40 inches of rain equivalent, not huge snowfalls. But the snow that's there doesn't really melt very much at all. So as a result, everywhere you go, glaciers. Glaciers coming down into the sea. There's countless glaciers, literally countless glaciers that come into the sea in Antarctica. Well, you probably could count them, but I'm not sure that anybody ever has. And there's also countless penguins, which is one of the joys of Antarctica. As you can see, there are some places where there are research stations that you can visit. This is Vinod Ski Base, which used to be a British station and is now a Ukrainian station. That's right, Roger, isn't it? Yep. And that's a fairly normal-sized iceberg in the background. So all of these big bergs are generated by glaciers or ice sheets. You also get sea ice, which builds up during the winter on the seawater. Sea ice is low-lying. It can build up a little bit as it gets crushed and compressed, but all the really big bergs are freshwater. This is at Vinod Ski Station. It's just a preserved interior that you can see from an early scientific station, 1950s, so everything remains preserved there. And also, something that you can find in Antarctica is the remnants of whaling, the whaling industry. This is on Deception Island. Photographically, it's an absolutely stunning place to visit if you enjoy doing dereliction, which I do. So, but it's also a very, very desperately sad and in some ways shocking thing to experience, to see how we industrialized the greatest creature that has ever lived on planet Earth, the great whales. And they were slaughtered mercilessly by our ancestors and brought to these places for a few decades only. But in those decades, and then particularly after these bases started to become less useful, and whaling ships, where all of the whaling happened on the factory ship, and these became semi-redundant, but that's when the slaughter intensified, and eventually we came to a point where the whales were disappearing, and finally a great treaty was established which has protected them more or less now for the last 30 years. This is within Deception Island. You can see that there are some fairly confident wildlife. This is a giant skua. It is actually a little bit smaller than our ship, but just a perspective. That's our ship in the background. Deception is a very interesting place. It's actually a drowned caldera, and it's a live volcano. So the perimeter is in the region of 10 miles, roughly, in diameter. Circumference sort of 25, 2030, I think. And the water in parts of it is really quite warm because of the volcanic activity. And it's a wonderful nature reserve, as well as having this extraordinary whaling station on it. Okay, now I'm going to just use the basis for my most recent trip, which was with Mark Carwardine, where we went to the Falklands, to South Georgia, and then to the Antarctic Peninsula as a kind of structure for this journey. And I'm going to start with the Southern Ocean, because the Southern Ocean, you've got to get used to it. You're going to be on it for more than half of the trip if you do this journey. There's less time at the visiting sites. So you've got to enjoy the experience of being out on the sea. Some of it is quite interesting. It can be very exciting. This is just about the limit of when it's acceptable to go out on deck. This is looking over the back of the ship and obviously lengthening the exposure a little bit. This gives an impression of the scale. Sometimes you find that as the ship rises and falls, and literally the sea is way up above you from deck position. And it's quite intimidating. And then, of course, the ship literally rides the wave. And this is almost what it feels like when you're in those sort of seas, with splattering of the rain and the snow as well. In order to go to South Georgia, you have to go through the Falklands, because you have to register your trip in the Falklands. The Falklands, Stanley in the Falklands, is actually the capital, nominally, of South Georgia. It's the administrative base of South Georgia. And the Falklands is actually a very interesting place to visit in its own right. Fairly low-lying archipelago of islands, but a great nature reserve with lots of interesting seabirds, a lot of albatross. These are black-browed albatross at West Point. Absolutely stunning birds. And they become quite familiar with visitors, so you can get really close to them. And there's also a fair number of people on the Falklands. Over 1,000 people live there. It's still got a very pioneering spirit. And if you're British, it's actually a very friendly place to go, especially having been in Argentina, where you set off from, in Ushuaia, which can feel quite intimidating at times. It's climate-wise not that different to the UK. It is colder because it's colder seawater, but there's some interesting sort of texture studies that can be made around the shore, and I found this little series quite interesting. Lots of extraordinary shapes and forms and textures in at the top of the tidal zone. So, but the real reason that you go via the Falklands is to visit this place. One of the most remarkable experiences for any photographer, I think, to visit. And that, I hope, gives you an idea of what the Falklands is like. It's truly like nowhere else. Sorry, what the South Georgia is like nowhere else at all. The really interesting thing for me was when I got home, having sort of been overwhelmed by this place, is to find that it's actually nearer to the equator than where I live and work. But because it's south of the Antarctic Convergence, it's constantly exposed to snow and ice all through the year. What's the Antarctic Convergence? It is this line here. It's not a distinct line. It's more of a zone. But south of that zone, the seawater never rises above about 1 degree centigrade. And as you can see, it wriggles and changes shape all the way around Antarctica. It more or less splits the peninsula from Tierra del Fuego. And at South Georgia, which is here, South Georgia is well south of it at that point. And as a result of that, even though it's relatively close to the equator, if you think of the north of England, being on the same latitude, more or less, there's year-round ice and snow. And hundreds of thousands of penguins wherever you go, which is really, really amazing. King penguins are stunning animals to look at. I'm no wildlife photographer. I wouldn't ever claim to be. And of course, they aren't really that big, but it's fun to get down low and experiment. This is Peter Bassett, who is a wildlife cameraman and director who produced a number of the David Attenborough TV programs. And it was great working with Pete, who's, of course, knows everything about penguins. They love people. You're not supposed to get within 5 meters of them, but to them, the invasion of red-coated hominids every so often is a source of great curiosity, and you can't avoid getting closer than 5 meters because they're going to come up and would probably shake your hand if they knew how to. Wonderful, amazing animals. These are elephant seal pups. And occasionally you'll see a few more of the larger elephant seals. Even a pup elephant seal is a big, big animal. Really incredible. And they and fur seals and king penguins and some other species of penguin dominate the shores of South Georgia. And as you can see, the glaciers come virtually down to sea level, but it can get quite warm on a summer morning or afternoon here. And the birds molt once a year, so they often need to cool off when they're molting. It's quite stressful for them, and they'll stand in the glacial meltwater thinking it's absolutely stewing while we're all wearing insulators. I think this gives some idea of the population. This is just one beach, St. Andrews in South Georgia, 100,000 nesting pairs. This is a city of penguins. And when our ancestors first visited here, the first sealers who came to South Georgia, they believed that these brown penguins were actually a separate species, whereas in fact they are king cubs. Fur seals are beautiful animals. They're also very, very aggressive, and you do need to be careful. They can hide in a tussock grass on the shoreline. And if you're not careful, they'll come and give you a bit of a fright when you're walking through there. On the other hand, elephant seals, you're very unlikely to miss one of those because they're absolutely gigantic. Some of them are 4 tons in weight. And as you can see, they often bear the scars. They're also very bad-tempered. So typical fighting scars there. South Georgia has the remnants of 7 different whaling stations on it, one of which, Stromness, was where Ernest Shackleton eventually arrived. If those of you who know of Shackleton, the great story of survival when his expedition failed and he had to retreat from his abandoned ship, the Endurance, in the ice. And he made this extraordinary journey on a little lifeboat all the way across the Southern Ocean from Elephant Island to South Georgia, and having arrived in South Georgia, they had to abandon their boat and literally walk across the mountain chain, and eventually they arrived at this place. And here's another one, and this is Leith, you can't visit these places now because they are riddled with asbestos, and it's simply too dangerous to go to. But you can go here to Grytviken, which is the administrative capital, such as it is, at least, of South Georgia. The actual capital is Stanley, as I say, but there are still a few people who work here. There's about 9, they're usually typically between 7 and 15 people, depending on whether it's winter or summer, living in Grytviken. So this is, as I say, about the size of Essex with 9 people on it. So highly densely populated with penguins, not with people. And what a phenomenal location as well. That's a midsummer day in South Georgia. Textures of what remains of the whaling industry. So the reason that you can visit Grytviken is that all of the buildings that sheltered the machinery and the drums for whaling have now been removed. So the kind of industrial relics are now exposed to the air, and it's possible to see them and hear the stories of how the whaling was carried out. It's a fantastic place photographically if you enjoy doing this kind of study. I suppose this is very typical of the mountain scenery of South Georgia, apart from the coastal fringe where you sometimes get glacial outwash and fairly normal beach evolution since the last ice age. Fundamentally, it's all mountains. It's literally just like the Andes dropped in the Southern Ocean. Elephant seal pups. And the reason I converted this one to black and white is it was a little bit more sympathetic, given that all of these human figures have got standard issue red overalls on. So it's a very limited range of biodiversity. There are no trees on South Georgia, and that sort of biodiversity is limited. But what is there is really fascinating and critical. Our ancestors brought rats with them, not deliberately, but inevitably. And after a remarkable operation of elimination, the authority here now believes it's got rid of rats, which will mean, hopefully, the re-establishment of ground nesting birds on the main island. They'd virtually disappeared from South Georgia. So European rats had literally wiped out all the bird species on the main island. But fortunately, some had survived on the outer islands of the archipelago. So with luck, we're already seeing some recovery of the South Georgia pipit, for example. So that's a really good news story. This gives an idea of what it's like. If you were to arrive on South Georgia and you wanted to walk from one side to the other, you first of all had to wade your way through the penguins in order to get up onto the foothills, and then you've got to cross those mountains to get to the other side. For some reason, penguins like mountain climbing. They'll go so far. I think they feel that it gives them some protection. The higher they get on the slope, the more protection they get from, and the more they can get away from fur seals and elephant seals as well. But for us as photographers, the lights, the scenery, the combination of landscape and wildlife is, I think, unique. And certainly for a kind of very hard-bitten landscape photographer like myself, it was a sort of fascinating challenge to actually have to think about the foreground keeps moving around, and how do you make that work and keep it balanced. And it's hard. It's no easy task being a wildlife photographer. So the Antarctic Peninsula, if you then travel from South Georgia to the peninsula, you have 3 to 4 days, depending on the prevailing winds, crossing this awful bit of seawater. And if you're very lucky, you might get a chance of going via Elephant Island and some of the outer islands of the Peninsula Archipelago. Sadly, we weren't able to do that because we are fighting against heavy waters most of the time. But I'm now going to show just what are effectively my favorite images from 3 visits to the Antarctic Peninsula, which is, in a sense, a tiny microcosm of Antarctica, the most visited part of Antarctica, and yet you might not see a single other ship while you're there. They are there, but the captains liaise together so they avoid line of sight if they possibly can. So most of the time, you feel that your ship is the only one in this vastness of the Southern Ocean, which is a wonderful conceit in a way. The whole of the peninsula is broken by this wonderful chain of islands just offshore, rather like the Pacific rim of North America or the Scottish mountain west, for example, where there's lots and lots of offshore islands. And the combination of islands, mountainous islands, and the very, very mountainous peninsula itself with permanent ice and snow, remarkable lighting conditions. You get good shelter from the Southern Ocean. Once you're this far south, usually the weather improves, perhaps ironically, and there's often sheltered water and beautiful lighting conditions, even when the weather on the face of it is far from ideal. And we've been to so many fascinating harbors, and each one is different. And of course, every time you go, it's completely different because the iceberg kind of population has totally changed. It's a very, very dynamic place to go. So as a landscape photographer, it's an absolute paradise on Earth. And every so often, something surprising happens. Although we did know there was going to be a full moon visible, so I was able to anticipate it and take a couple of pictures before mentioning it to the group out on deck with them. Suddenly I felt like I was surrounded by machine gun fire as all the cameras started clicking. That was with an American group, admittedly. But I think this iceberg looks a bit like a sphinx, but I mean, wherever you look at icebergs, for me, they're just endlessly fascinating. There's simply no iceberg is the same. Even the ones that come from the big ice shelves, tabular bergs, which on the face of it will evolve in quite a similar fashion, but inevitably they break up and decay in different ways. The textures change. Often they will roll and tip, so you get these strange tide lines where areas have been below the water level and then come back up. And they change when snow falls on them, which sticks to them sometimes. This, by the way, just gives you a sense of when we travel around on the water in Antarctica, you're in Zodiacs, which will typically have one driver and 10 to 12 passengers. And sometimes it's snowing, but it's well worth it to get down really close to the water. The wildlife is always unpredictable. These are Antarctic shags. Cue a joke, but I won't. And just when you think you've seen everything with an iceberg, something new turns up. And they often do look like a geological cross-section because they're literally layer upon layer upon layer of snowfall, some of it very ancient. And the older the ice, the more extreme it tends to become colored and compressed over time. Some bergs are the remnants of relatively recent, as in hundreds of years old, of the accumulation of ice and snow, and others are literally tens of thousands of years, the ice that you can find there. It can be really incredible to see this ancient ice. And in many ways, the worse the weather, the better it is for photography. Every so often you come across places that human beings have been and set up camp or set up some kind of weather station, and inevitably, eventually, the weather takes it back because the winds can blow here at over 100 miles an hour during the Antarctic spring, when these extraordinary foehn winds start blowing off the continent, and it's very, very hard to live there then. Somehow the penguins keep going, but they tend to settle a little bit after that period. These are Gentoo penguins. And 2 humans, lesser spotted humans. These are chin straps. Most of these penguin species are really quite small, but they're very feisty as well. You know, they don't, they won't take prisoners, and some of them aren't very happy to see you. Especially the smaller they are, the more vicious they seem to be. But most of them really are very just curious. This is Bailey Head on Deception Island. I think there's 50,000 nesting pairs there of chin straps. We were very lucky on our first trip to Antarctica with Mark Howardine to sleep out overnight on one of the islands in good weather, and it meant that we could be on land during sunset, which was, for me, was great. I just felt released from the constant bobbing of movements. I was able to set up a tripod at last. Yes. So tripod a lot of the time is surplus to requirements when you're on the ship or on a Zodiac. So sunset was about 11 o'clock, and then the alarm went at 2, and sunrise was 3 o'clock. But at least there was a sunrise and sunset because you are still north of the Antarctic Circle itself. That's the point at which the sun just kisses the horizon on Midsummer's Day. The whales are a feature of visits to Antarctica, but not being a wildlife photographer, I haven't done a great deal of photography with whales active in the water, but you can find the remnants of them in various places. It's just incredible. That's just part of the vertebra, and it's not even a particularly big whale. That gives you an idea, the contrast of scale between a whale vertebra and a penguin. I actually set this composition up to photograph the beached berg, and I'd been there for a while, and these gentoos just started moving past, so they kept getting in the way. So I thought, oh, well, may as well make the most of that then. But it's frustrating, actually. Being a landscape photographer, I generally like to work in low ISOs with quite long shutter speeds, and it's a bit awkward when the foreground keeps moving, so you have to learn to use fast shutter speeds. This is a fantastic humpback whale experience we had on our first trip there. There were 3 zodiacs in the water, and I was on one of those, and this fully grown humpback came in close to us and literally just swam with us for 20, 25 minutes, just popping up, spy hopping here, having a look at us. It seemed to want to play. It wanted contact with us. It literally, most people were crying by the end of it. It was the most moving, amazing experience, especially when you know that this giant 35, 40 tons of whale can breach, and some of you may have seen these, there was an example of a whale breaching over a kayak off the Pacific coast of California, I think it was, recently, and they could wipe you out with a single blow of any of their flukes, but they're very, very gentle mostly. Just curious. And what's really amazing is when you remember that only 3 generations ago we were literally employed in the business of slaughtering them. There was a time when in this area near the Lemaire Channel where there were reports that the sailors said they could virtually walk to shore on the backs of whales, so abundant were the whales at the time. And as you can imagine, it's not like that anymore. Fortunately, humpbacks are making a great recovery. But the iceberg landscape is always changing. You never know what you're going to discover. Like gigantic abstractions, sort of expressions of, to me, it was like working in a huge art gallery that was constantly changing around me. This is the Lemaire Channel, using a slightly longer exposure and a tripod just to try and emphasize the motion of the ship. The Lemaire Channel is this amazing narrows where the mainland and one of the islands, and this is an island, those mountains are, come close and the ship moves through there. If you're lucky enough to be able to navigate through it, sometimes it gets clogged up with sea ice and it's impossible to penetrate the channel. But it's really one of the most memorable experiences you can have in landscape, rounding the corner and finding this range of mountains. So this is sea ice here in the foreground, fairly kind of unconsolidated, uncompressed, whereas the spear or the spire is a remnant of glacial freshwater ice. And often you're looking at the two together. Generally speaking, zodiac etiquette is that you don't stand up, but if it's calm enough and you ask the permission of the driver, he or she may say, yes, that's fine, and obviously they're all very keen that we should get good photographs, so there's a sort of certain way of doing things. This is fairly old glacial ice. Some of it's really just Gothic, and especially in really grim weather with fresh snow as well, it takes on a completely different guise. This is really quite a big iceberg here, but the mountain is something else altogether. And that's about a mile in the distance, just to put it into perspective. And that's why I really think that bad weather is often great weather for photography. This is Nico Harbour, looking out now towards the Bransfield Strait, which is the main strait between the South Shetland Islands and the peninsula. This is just the edge of a glacier, Antarctic turn. By the way, there are also Arctic turns in the Antarctic, just to complicate issue. And with a polarizer, you can see a little bit more of the icebergs below the surface. This is as we're emerging again onto the Bransfield Strait. You can see the wind whipping over the Southern Ocean. It's absolutely bitter shooting from the ship when it's as windy as that. But obviously great lighting. Middle of the day, actually. That's fairly typical Southern Ocean territory. A ship plunging to and fro. And if you do suffer from seasickness, one of the best ways, I think, to get around it is to spend time up on the bridge and just watch the horizon, get orientated around it. And usually, if you can be positive about that, you can get over your problems. It can be quite exciting. But it's very, very odd when you come down on a wave and 6,500 tons of ship sort of shudders as it goes bang, and you know this huge plume, tons and tons of seawater just wash back over the prow like that. That's it. Thank you. Well, for me, that's pretty good because I usually waffle on far too long, so I managed to finish on time. Anyone got any questions on Antarctica or photography in Antarctica? Yes, well, I can. So a question about the settings, camera settings. Yes, it's a bit of a mix. So in fact, there's a couple of pictures in there that were shot with a Phase 1 on the back of a Phase 1 camera. But the vast majority was shot with Sony cameras. There were a couple that were done with a Nikon D800, and also a couple with a Panasonic G3. So that was on my first trip. But all of the recent work was done with Sony A7R, Sony A7 II, or Sony A7R Mark II. And with those, it's a mix of original prime lenses and some zooms as well. So but a real wide range of different cameras. I hope it's not really noticeable because obviously that's not what it's about. But it's the mixture of 16 to 35 mil zooms, 70 to 200. There's a couple that were shot with a 55, f1.8, that sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah, so if you're, most of the time, my kind of philosophy of shooting is that I want a limitation. And one of my limitations is to say, okay, my native ISO, I know I'm going to get my best dynamic range, my greatest freedom from noise and artifacting there. But I might get movement. Now, if you can make an image where there's something still and something that's in motion, I love playing with that combination, that synthesis of sharp form and motion blur. So, for example, the picture of the Lemaire Channel, made with the wake of the ship, was probably at around about a quarter of a second, shot off the back of the ship, probably at ISO 100, maybe at f8, f11, but at fairly early in the morning, and it was with a filter. So that was deliberate, but for somewhere you need to handhold. So if we think about the pictures of the penguins at St. Andrews Bay, quite a few of them were handheld. So I would have put the ISO up probably to 200 and then work with maybe a F11. And it's fairly bright, so you could probably get away with about a 60th or an 80th of a second. Sometimes a little bit higher than that. So the ISO would have had to have then gone up to 400, 800 maybe. I'm very, very, very conservative. I'm sure you could put it up higher than that. All my wildlife colleagues are always shooting at ISO 6,400, and but it's very counterintuitive. But they were getting great images. So I actually quite like that suggestion of movement. I actually really, really do embrace that. So I want something to be sharp. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Sorry, come a bit closer, and I'll repeat your question so everybody can hear it.
So if I want to do a trip like that, what do I do? How do I do it? How do you prepare? Basically, what's on the table?
Yeah, it's a good question. How do you prepare for it? Well, the first way to prepare for it is make sure your bank balance is reasonably healthy. It's not a cheap thing to do. But in all honesty, if you end up, let's say, if you were lucky enough to be able to afford it, you will have to probably think about £8,000 to £12,000 as a budget if you factor in airfares and maybe a bit of travel before and after. So that's going to be for a 10 days to 2 weeks trip. Then it's not that. Actually, the South Georgia trip is longer and it's a little bit more expensive for obvious reasons. But I think it's really money well spent. It is an experience you can't really have any other way. If you were super wealthy, you could charter your own ship, which might be nice because then you could set the agenda. But then you're talking, $750,000 maybe. So if we assume you're going to do what we did, most people on the ship are, not necessarily the youngest. Most people are in good shape. It does help if you're reasonably fit, but you don't have to be super fit. It helps if you're reasonably well equipped, but you don't have to be, a lot of things are provided. So you Wellington boots, foul weather outer gear, all of that comes with the ship. So you don't have to worry about that. So in actual fact, it's not as complicated as you might imagine. I think from your own point of view, make sure if you're going to do it that you feel well. You don't come with some kind of difficult illness that you're fighting against. Because clearly, when you're out, so you go quite a bit of the time, you're inside in the warm comfort of the ship. You go out onto the deck, it's really damp and it can be very cold and slippery. So one thing that sometimes happens, and the staff are constantly reminding us of this, is you must always watch out for your footing. The ship takes a lurch and it's slippery. It's those sorts of things that are actually the biggest worry, because if you make a picture it doesn't work, well, it's annoying, but if you fall over and break a wrist, it's a bit of a disaster. And that does happen. Fortunately, we've been really, really, all our trips have been very good. People have been very thoughtful and careful when they're moving around, but you do hear stories about people who take, maybe don't take enough care. It's a big part of it as a member of the passenger group is to be responsible. Because if you have a bad day, everyone else does as well. You often end up you may literally have to have the ship up to turn around and go back to Stanley, for example, so you can go to hospital. Yes, what time of year? So there's a relatively, actually it's quite a wide window. The window runs from the beginning of November until pretty much the end of March. That's the season for Antarctica. You can't go before then because the peninsula is too clogged up with sea ice, usually, most years. And by the end of March, the sea ice is starting to reform. That's really the limiting factor. Through the course of the season, at the beginning of the season, there's very few whales. The penguins are gathering, and the landscape is stunning because it's still snowy right down to sea level. The penguin colonies have only just started to evolve, so it's really clean, and the beaches are full of fresh snow. And what happens is, as you go through the season, so the landscape value kind of decays a little bit because the penguin, there's a lot of penguin degradation. Let's say they've got to do their business somewhere. So the snow becomes a lot yellower and murkier and less of it on the beaches. And the snow starts to decay higher up on the slopes as well. But the whales start to gather. So you get more and more whales all the way into January. So they're really at their most abundant in February. So in February, we've seen bubble net feeding in the Bransfield Strait and in the shallows in Antarctica, which is fantastic to see. Absolutely, it's one of the great sights, I think, of wildlife, to see humpback whales. You see these kind of huge, well, you've probably seen it on the TV. Most of you will have seen bubble net feeding on TV. It's just, and you can get relatively good photographs of that as well. So you've still got to be ready, but they will continually do it for maybe half an hour, bringing up shoals of fish. And even if you don't get any pictures, it's a stunning thing to see, so obviously. But by then, towards the end of February, March, it's maybe starting to snow a bit more. So if you're really lucky, you can get the best of both worlds. But on the whole, all through the season is good. It just depends what your priorities are. I would say if you're a wildlife priority, you'd probably go a little bit later, January, February. But if you're landscape, maybe a little bit earlier. But really, the landscape's fantastic all the time, I think.